The studio lights blazed as the audience hushed, sensing the tension about to erupt. On one side sat Denzel Washington, calm yet razor-sharp, his posture betraying confidence forged over decades. Opposite him, J.D. Vance leaned forward, smirking like he had prepared a trap. The moderator barely had time to set the topic before Vance launched his opening jab. "Denzel," Vance began, his tone dripping with condescension, "you've won Oscars, sure. But do they really prove anything? Or are they just Hollywood trophies given out to those who play the game?" His words hung in the air, sharp, cutting, deliberately designed to provoke. The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't a policy debate, this was a challenge to a man's legacy. Denzel's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, silence took over the room. Every camera zoomed in, capturing the moment. The crowd expected him to brush it off, maybe laugh politely. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice steady but firm, and said, "Be careful, J.D. You're not questioning a statue, you're questioning the years, the blood, the sacrifices behind it." The first 30 seconds of the broadcast had already set the internet ablaze. Twitter feeds lit up. Clips spread instantly. Commentators whispered, "This isn't just an interview. This is about to become a war of words." Vance smiled wider, mistaking the gravity in Denzel's voice for weakness. "I'm just asking," he pressed, "if Oscars aren't more about politics than talent. Because out here in the real world, people don't care about Hollywood." The line was meant to land like a finishing blow. But instead, it was fuel. Denzel straightened, locked eyes with the senator, and delivered a slow, measured response that felt less like words and more like a blade being unsheathed. "Then why, J.D., does the whole world remember the stories Hollywood tells, while no one remembers the speeches you give?" The studio gasped. The war had begun. The moderator tried to interject, but it was too late. The energy in the room had shifted entirely. Denzel's last line had landed like a thunderclap, and the audience, though sitting still, radiated anticipation. Vance's smirk faltered for just a second before he quickly recovered, determined not to be humiliated. "Let's be real," Vance shot back, his voice rising, "actors live in a bubble. You read scripts someone else wrote, wear costumes, and pretend for a camera. Meanwhile, the rest of America works real jobs, faces real struggles. Oscars are symbols of privilege, not sacrifice." A murmur rippled across the studio. It wasn't just an attack on Denzel, it was an attack on art itself. The cameras captured Denzel's face as he slowly leaned back in his chair, a small, knowing smile curving his lips. He let the silence linger, an actor's timing, perfected over decades. Then he spoke. "You call it pretending, J.D. I call it truth. When I play a man who lost everything, someone in the audience sees themselves. When I deliver a line about dignity, it isn't just dialogue, it's someone's story finally being told. That's not a bubble. That's reality with the volume turned up." The crowd erupted, clapping and shouting before the moderator could even restore order. Vance raised his hand, trying to cut through the noise, but the momentum had already slipped from his grasp. He attempted one more blow. "But these awards, your Oscars, don't represent America. They're Hollywood insiders patting themselves on the back." Denzel's eyes glinted under the studio lights. He leaned forward again, his tone suddenly sharper, stripping away the calm. "Let me tell you something, Senator. That golden statue you dismiss? It came after decades of 5 a.m. rehearsals, after nights I didn't know if I'd eat, after choices that broke me down before they built me up. You think that's Hollywood privilege? That's survival." The studio fell silent, not from boredom, but from the weight of the words. For a fleeting moment, even Vance seemed unsure of his footing. The cameras zoomed in again, broadcasting Denzel's face to millions of viewers who knew they were watching not a debate, but a dismantling. The room wasn't just listening anymore. It was witnessing. Vance adjusted his tie, clearly unsettled but unwilling to show weakness. His jaw tightened as he tried to find a line that would win back control. Survival, he scoffed. Tell that to families in Ohio who lost jobs when Hollywood offshored work to make movies cheaper. Tell that to steelworkers who don't get applause or gold statues when they struggle to put food on the table. You don't know hardship, Denzel, you know spotlights. The words hung heavy, aimed like daggers at Denzel's credibility. For a brief second, the crowd seemed divided, some nodding, others waiting for the counterpunch they knew was coming. Denzel didn't disappoint. He leaned forward, his voice low but cutting through the studio like a blade. Don't lecture me on struggle, Senator. I buried friends who didn't make it out of the streets I grew up on. I watched my mother work double shifts to keep the lights on. And when I walked into audition rooms, I was told I was too black, too poor, too much of a risk. That wasn't the spotlight, that was the shadow. And I fought my way through it. The audience roared, some even rising to their feet, the energy now electric. Vance tried to interrupt, but Denzel wasn't done. His tone sharpened, his words hitting like hammer strikes. You want to talk about those families in Ohio? They don't need another politician throwing blame like confetti. They need leadership. They need someone who actually listens. You don't fix a broken system by mocking the people who survive it, you fix it by respecting them. The moderator's voice cracked as he tried to restore order, but the clash had spiraled beyond control. Viewers at home weren't just watching a debate, they were watching two Americas colliding in real time. One rooted in politics, the other in lived experience. And at that moment, the balance of the room was clear. Denzel's words weren't just spoken, they were felt. Every syllable landed like proof that he wasn't defending himself, he was defending everyone who had ever been dismissed, doubted, or degraded. Vance's smirk had vanished. For the first time that night, he looked like the one under interrogation. The camera zoomed in on Vance's face, sweat barely visible under the studio lights. He forced a chuckle, trying to mask his discomfort. So now you're the voice of America, he sneered. You act in movies. You give speeches. But when it comes to policy, when it comes to building real solutions, you've got nothing but stories. Stories don't pay bills. Stories don't bring back jobs. It was a calculated jab, designed to strip Denzel of credibility by reducing his words to mere theatrics. But the crowd, already leaning toward Denzel, reacted with unease, some boos, a scattered applause. The tension was thick, a live wire sparking between two worlds. Denzel leaned back in his chair, letting the insult hang for a moment before answering. His pause wasn't weakness, it was control. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through with a weight that silenced the studio. Stories don't pay bills, he repeated. Tell that to the young man who stayed in school because a story showed him a future. Tell that to the soldier who made it home because a story gave him hope. Stories are the blueprint of change, Senator. They remind us of who we are, and who we refuse to become. The crowd erupted, clapping and shouting, their energy breaking the thin balance of the debate. Vance tried to talk over the noise, his voice rising, his composure fraying. This isn't about inspiration, it's about reality, he barked. Denzel leaned forward, pointing directly at him. Reality is this: America doesn't trust politicians who cash checks off division. Reality is, the people you claim to represent are tired of being told their props in your speeches. They don't want pity, Senator. They want dignity. And if you can't understand the power of that, then maybe you're not the leader you think you are. The room shook with cheers, the moderator waving his hands in vain. The clash was no longer a debate, it was a trial, and the jury was the audience. And in that moment, their verdict was clear. Vance slammed his hand on the desk, his voice cracking with frustration. You sit there preaching like you've got all the answers, he snapped, his face flushing red. But where were you when families lost their homes? Where were you when factories shut down across Ohio? You were in Hollywood, collecting awards while my people struggled. The jab was sharp, personal, aimed at painting Denzel as distant, privileged, out of touch. The crowd gasped at the audacity, and for a split second, silence blanketed the studio. Denzel slowly stood, not in anger, but in deliberate calm. The studio lights seemed to follow him as he rose, his presence filling every corner of the room. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. "You think pain has a zip code, Senator?" he asked quietly, almost too quietly. The audience leaned forward, straining to hear. "You think suffering only exists where you decide to see it? I buried friends from the streets of New York, men who didn't make it past 21. I've walked through hospitals where children fought for their last breath. Don't talk to me about suffering like I haven't lived it." The words hit harder than any insult, each syllable laced with raw truth. The crowd erupted, stomping and clapping, some even shouting Denzel's name. Vance tried to interject, but his voice was drowned out by the roar. The moderator leaned in, desperate to keep control. "Gentlemen, please." But Denzel wasn't finished. He turned his gaze back to Vance, steady and unyielding. "You want to talk about Ohio? Let's talk about America. People everywhere are tired of being statistics, tired of leaders who point fingers but never lift hands. You keep asking me where I was. Here's my question to you, Senator, where are you now?" The crowd exploded again, this time with a deafening chant, "Denzel. Denzel." The cameras captured Vance shrinking in his chair, his arguments dissolving under the weight of the moment. The moderator's voice cracked as he tried to cut through the chaos. "Order, please. We need order." But the crowd wasn't listening. The chant of Denzel echoed like thunder rolling through the studio, spilling into millions of living rooms across the country. Vance's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the desk. He forced a smile, but it looked more like a grimace. "This isn't a movie set," he sneered, raising his voice above the noise. "This is real life, and real life doesn't give out standing ovations for speeches. It demands solutions." The jab was meant to ground the moment, to strip Denzel of the aura that had electrified the room. But instead, it only fed the fire. Denzel tilted his head, the faintest grin tugging at his lips. "You finally said something true, Senator," he replied. "This isn't Hollywood. But maybe that's why people are clapping, because they're not hearing rehearsed talking points for once. They're hearing truth." The audience erupted again, half cheers, half laughter, and the moderator buried his face in his notes, unable to restore control. Vance's composure cracked. He leaned forward, finger pointed like a weapon. "You think you can solve this country's problems with stories and emotion? You're just an actor, Denzel. Nothing more." The room went still. Even the cameras seemed to zoom closer, sensing a pivotal moment. Denzel didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto Vance's, unwavering, like steel sharpening steel. "And yet," he said slowly, his voice a low rumble, "in 5 minutes, I've connected with these people more than you have in your entire career. Maybe the question isn't what I am, it's why you aren't." The line detonated like dynamite. The audience was on its feet, clapping, stomping, shouting over one another. The moderator threw his hands up in defeat. Vance's face burned crimson, his body stiff, as if holding himself together by sheer will. For the first time all night, he looked small. The camera panned across the audience, faces wide-eyed, mouths open, phones raised high to capture every second. It was no longer just a debate, it felt like history unfolding in real time. Vance clenched his jaw, trying to pull himself back into control. He lifted his chin and spoke with forced calm. "This is exactly the problem, ladies and gentlemen. Politics turned into a circus. A man wins applause because he's good with words, not because he has answers. We don't need applause, we need policy." It was a strong line on paper, but in the room, it fell flat. The energy had shifted. People weren't looking for bullet points, they were hungry for something real. Denzel leaned forward, elbows on the desk, his gaze steady. "You keep saying policy like it's a magic word," he said. But policies don't matter if the people behind them don't understand suffering. You want to talk policy? Fine. What's your policy for the father working 3 jobs who still can't afford rent? For the mother choosing between medicine and groceries? For the young man who thinks the streets are his only option because no one gave him a chance? Each question landed like a hammer, punctuated by murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Vance stammered, his polished veneer cracking. Well, that's complicated. Denzel's voice sharpened. No. It's not complicated. It's ignored. And when leaders like you ignore it, people like me won't stay silent. The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. The audience roared, stomping their feet, the floor shaking under the weight of their approval. Vance tried to push back, desperation creeping into his tone. You think speeches solve problems? They don't feed families. They don't create jobs. Denzel didn't miss a beat. But they can inspire the change that does. And tonight, Senator, it's clear who's inspiring and who's scrambling. The crowd exploded, chanting his name again, drowning out whatever Vance tried to say next. The moderator glanced helplessly at the producers, but even they knew, no one could stop the storm now. The tension in the studio reached a fever pitch. The chants echoing Denzel's name still rumbled through the walls when Vance raised his hand, demanding silence. His face flushed red, his voice trembling with frustration. You think this is entertainment, Denzel. But let me remind you, this isn't Hollywood. This is politics. Lives are at stake, and we don't need actors pretending to be saviors. The insult cut through the noise like a blade. A hush fell. Even the moderators froze, unsure whether to intervene. Denzel tilted his head, slowly, like a predator circling its prey. He chuckled, but it wasn't light, it was sharp, dangerous. Did you just call me an actor pretending? He asked, his tone deceptively calm. Let me educate you, Senator. Acting is about telling truth so people can feel it. And tonight, this audience feels it. They feel the truth you've been running from. The crowd erupted again, clapping and whistling, drowning out Vance's protests. Cameras zoomed in on his face, beads of sweat glistening under the stage lights. You see, Denzel continued, leaning closer, his voice dropping into a growl, my work has always been about giving voice to those who don't have one. When I walk off a stage, I know people leave changed. Can you say the same about your speeches, Senator? Or do people just leave wondering how you manage to dodge every real question? The audience roared, some even standing, clapping above their heads. The sound shook Vance visibly, his lips moved, but no sound came out. Finally, he slammed his hand on the desk. This is not a courtroom drama, Denzel. You don't get to win with theatrics. But Denzel's reply was instant, slicing through the chaos, then maybe stop giving people a reason to cheer against you. The room detonated. The crowd was no longer an audience. They were an army behind Denzel, their chants filling the broadcast. Vance looked cornered, his composure shattered, as though the spotlight itself had turned into a judgment seat. And in that moment, it was clear, this was no longer a debate. It was a public reckoning. The moderators, sensing the chaos slipping from their control, tried to cut in. Gentlemen, let's move to the next topic. But the crowd wasn't ready to move on. Their voices thundered, Denzel. Denzel, drowning out everything. Vance leaned forward, his jaw clenched tight. His microphone caught the low growl in his voice, they're cheering for a performance, not for policy. Denzel didn't flinch. He straightened his posture, his eyes locked on Vance with the calm of someone who had already won. Performance, he repeated slowly, almost savoring the word. Then he gestured to the audience. No, Senator. That's not a performance. That's recognition. Recognition that truth finally walked into this room. The roar doubled. The camera cut between the audience's wild applause and Vance's face, which was visibly crumbling. Denzel leaned into his mic, his voice low but sharp, like steel against glass. You keep trying to paint me as just an actor. But let's be honest, you've been playing a role too. The role of a politician who talks about family values while cutting funding for real families. The role of a leader who speaks of opportunity while slamming doors shut on those who need them most. Tell me, Senator, how's that script working out for you? The studio went silent for a beat, an eerie silence that lasted just long enough to feel heavy. And then it broke like a dam. People clapped, shouted, even whistled, as if the walls themselves couldn't contain the energy. Vance slammed back, shouting above the noise. This isn't your stage, Denzel. This is the future of America. Denzel didn't miss a beat. His voice cut straight through the chaos, exactly. And that's why you're losing them. Because America is tired of lines rehearsed for cameras. They want something real. They want someone who doesn't dodge when asked the hard questions. The audience was on their feet now. The chant that shook the building was unmistakable, real. 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 Vance looked trapped. His hands shook as he gripped the podium. The moderators were powerless. The camera zoomed in on Denzel's steady, unshaken face, and the nation watching could feel it. This wasn't just a clash. It was humiliation, live and unfiltered. The tension in the studio was unbearable. The chant of real, real, real was still echoing when the moderator, desperate, tried one last time. Senator Vance, do you want to respond before we close? Vance's face was red, his lips trembling with frustration. He raised his hand, but his words stumbled. This is not a game. This is about responsibility, about leadership, about. But his voice cracked. The audience leaned back, unimpressed. Cameras caught the sweat on his forehead, the twitch in his jaw. He looked small, swallowed by the weight of the moment. Denzel, calm as stone, finally broke the silence with a voice as steady as a drumbeat. You're right, Senator. This isn't a game. But you've been playing one for far too long, pretending you care, pretending you fight for the people while serving the powerful. Tonight, the mask slipped. The audience gasped. Denzel's words weren't shouted, they were delivered like a verdict. Final. Irrefutable. He turned slightly toward the camera, as if speaking directly to the millions watching at home. An Oscar doesn't define me. But what I do with my voice does. And tonight, the people decided who they trust. Not with applause for a performance, but with the truth they've been starving for. Thunderous applause erupted, shaking the stage. Some in the audience stood on their chairs, waving their arms, screaming Denzel's name. The sound was overwhelming, a wave that drowned out everything else. Vance's shoulders slumped. His eyes darted around, searching for support, but finding none. The moderators shuffled papers nervously, unsure how to salvage the show. And then, with one last crushing blow, Denzel looked directly at Vance. His voice was low, steady, but it cut like a knife. You questioned my Oscar. I questioned your character. Only one of those matters when the credits roll. The crowd exploded. People jumped to their feet, some recording with their phones, others shouting in disbelief. Hashtags began flooding social media instantly. Hashtag Denzel vs. Vance, hashtag Truth Wins, hashtag Oscar Question. The final shot lingered on Vance's defeated posture as the chants of Denzel. Denzel roared like thunder. The moment wasn't just viral, it was history etched in real time. Denzel leaned forward, his voice steady but burning with conviction. You can take away awards, you can question my legacy, you can try to tear down everything I've built, but you cannot erase truth. I don't need an Oscar to prove my worth. I don't need Hollywood's validation to know who I am. My story, my struggle, my victories, they belong to the people who see themselves in me. And no amount of politics, spin, or cheap shots will ever change that. Remember this, respect is earned, not handed out like a trophy. And I've earned mine in ways you'll never understand. The studio fell into a deep silence, the weight of his words pressing into every corner of the room. Even Vance, visibly rattled, had no comeback. Cameras captured the moment as the audience erupted into thunderous applause. Denzel had not just defended his Oscar, he had redefined what it truly meant.